About a month ago, a blacksmith called Alex Pole sent me a package. He reached out initially after seeing me experiment with different types of metals in my clays, so he said he'd send me a few things, some byproducts from his smithing. He was also kind enough to send me a copy of his book, Blacksmith, Apprentice to Master, which, like you might imagine, takes you on a journey through the different stages of learning to become a metalworker, and it's full of interesting stories, recipes, history and technique, all beautifully bound and with brilliant photographs inside. As for the scrap metal he included, he packed up 2 different types. There are bronze filings and hammer scale produced from hammering steel. Alex has told me that the hammer scale is pure oxide and it's relatively soft and flaky stuff, although if you catch it from the right angle, it is very sharp. As for the bronze, these feel like trimmings produced from turning metal on a lathe. They hold their shape much better, and I imagine I'm going to feel these more when throwing and trimming it. Yet, I've never used bronze like this mixed into clay, so I honestly have no idea how it's going to look once fired. As for the steel hammer scale, I've been mixing various irons into my clay for a few years now, so I've got a rough idea of what it might look like, but time will tell. And before I can begin using these materials properly in my work, I first need to make 2 tests, and in this case I'm just going to mix the metals into 2 half-pound lumps of clay, which is 223 grams. I didn't weigh out the metal, instead I just added a small heap to each, as with this first test, all I want to see really is what the metal does once it fires and melts. And before I can throw each bowl, I first have to mix the lumps thoroughly so the metal is distributed evenly throughout the stoneware. And just so I can keep track of things, I score a B or an S into the lump of clay so I know which I'm working with. And as you've all seen me throw bowls dozens of times before, I'll speed through this process this time. And perhaps the thing I'm most curious about is how this metal will feel beneath my hands as these pots are thrown. And, surprisingly, I can barely feel the bronze here. It occasionally snags against a fingertip and grinds against my knuckle, but compared to some of the very sandy, groggy clays I've been working with, it's barely even noticeable. You will hear it though, when metal tools grind against them, and I very quickly switched to using a plastic kidney as this sort of compresses the surface, pushing the metal shards in rather than scraping them across the surface and removing them, although that's something I won't really be able to avoid when it comes to trimming these. Also, I should note, as because I don't know how these metals are going to react once fired, I'm collecting all the scraps from the throwing and trimming process so they aren't introduced to my normal reclaim bucket. This way no specks of bronze or hammer scale contaminate and find their way into future pots I make. And once again I could barely feel the hammer scale, although at times the sharp edges did dig into my fingers. But not enough to cause harm. Ultimately, the reason I'm being so careful about contamination is that I heard from a few people on Instagram who fired with bronze and have experienced it melting through clay, and that it's even bored holes through the kiln shelves during the firings. So until I know that I can work with it safely, I need to be very controlled about where I allow this metal, as the last thing I want is molten metal damaging my electric or gas kiln. So, with both bowls thrown, I jot a note next to each so I can keep track of which is which. Even though I can tell visually, it's better being safe than sorry. And then, the following day, once both the bowls have turned leather hard, they can be trimmed. Instead of making bowls, I could have just built 2 very simple test tiles to fire the materials that way, but in some cases I prefer testing materials on actual pots, so I can see how they react on a shape that I could actually make in the future. Plus, if they do fire well, then I have 2 actual pots I can keep and sell or exhibit. Trimming these is when I could really feel the metal beginning to grind against the tools, and it's for that reason that I'm using these cheap steel turning tools, as if I were using my tungsten carbide trimmers like shown and discussed in my previous video, their blades could very easily be chipped by these spinning chunks of metal, so it's best to avoid that. I then secured the pot down by the rim and then continued on to finishing the base and turning the foot. This is the pot that contains the steel hammer scale, and as they're so thin and flaky, they really do just disappear into the stoneware, and the turning tool just breaks and shatters them as I trim over the surface, leaving me with a relatively neat and smooth finish. I hope I'm not removing too much of the metal, as I have no idea how well this metal is going to melt and permeate to the surface during the reduction firing. As steel is mostly iron, I imagine these black flecks are going to melt into small droplets of metal on the surface of the glaze. Hopefully they'll even melt and flow down the shape a little bit, and if it's anything like the rust, ilmenite or other iron sources I've used before, I shouldn't have to worry too much about it causing any damage to the kiln, but that won't stop me from being overly cautious. Next, it's the bronze bowl's turn to be trimmed, and these metal inclusions really dragged across the surface, leaving long gouges in the clay that I tried to burnish over as best I can with this smooth plastic kidney. Bronze is made up from mostly copper combined with tin, and in some cases even aluminium, manganese, zinc and nickel, all of which can do rather interesting things in a reduction firing. Copper, especially, is known for creating very intense, vibrant red colours when fired in the correct manner, so I have an inkling this will be a very red, spotty pot, but I'm hoping there'll be slightly more than that, and that the other metals included create even more interest. You can see the inclusions here, the pot is covered in them, so whatever happens I think this pot is going to be rather dramatic. With the two pots trimmed, I'll now let these turn bone dry over a couple of days before they can be packed into my electric kiln and fired to 1000 degrees Celsius. Now, those comments about bronze melting through the kiln shelf really put the fear in me, so I made 4 thick trays, like this, from a coarse stoneware clay body which I lined with porcelain slip and bisque fired prior to firing these bowls. The idea being that if any metal does run off these, the thick trays will catch it, protecting the kiln shelves beneath. This might all be overkill, but you haven't seen anything yet. But as bronze melts at a relatively low temperature, I'm also going to be propping each bowl up on a few feet made from this stuff, wadding. This is a mixture of 50% china clay and 50% coarse alumina hydrate. I mix it into a clay-like consistency and then place a few balls of the stuff underneath each pot, raising it up. This way, if the metal does melt and flow down the surface of the pot, it shouldn't fuse itself to the tray. This is actually a technique used for most atmospheric firings, such as wood, salt or soda firings. Simply put, in these kilns, the glaze is carried around by the flames in the atmosphere, and by having small feet like these that separate it from the shelf, there's no way the pots can fuse themselves down. Yet, if things do get very glassy and sticky beneath the pot, you often have to grind the waddings away carefully without damaging the pot itself. As for the wadding mixture, I keep it sprayed down with water, stuffed with plastic, and then I seal the container, as wadding tends to dry out very quickly. I then placed each bowl in a tray on a prop into my electric kiln for a bisque firing overnight to 1000 degrees Celsius. 2 days later, and the kiln is now cool enough to unpack. And yes, I did add even more kiln shelves beneath these pots off camera, as if the metal did melt, well, it could bore through those if it wanted to. But at first glance, everything looks surprisingly fine, which is a huge relief. As if the bronze did melt and cause a mess at this stage, then in the gas firing to 1290 degrees, it would be 10 times worse. And here they are. The bronze to begin with, the metal inclusions just beginning to melt. The clay around them looks singed, but I honestly thought they would melt and move a lot more than this, so I'm happily surprised. Next, the steel hammer scale, which you can barely make out, save for a few larger flecks. Before I glaze these, the feet of each is waxed. This acts just like a wax resist, preventing the glaze from adhering to this area, meaning I have to spend less time tidying up each pot after they've been dipped in glaze. Additionally, if the entire pot was coated and I simply placed the whole pot inside the kiln for its gas firing without any protection such as wadding underneath it, then it would just fuse to the kiln shelf, the glaze melting and then cooling and fusing it in place. Next, I'll be coating these in my pale green crackle glaze, and again I'm just making some notes on this board so I can tell which is which, as once glazed the metal on the surface will be hidden. I then grasp each bowl tightly with a pair of tongs and slide it into the glaze. It's held underneath for 5 or 6 seconds, before being drawn out and flipped in such a way that much of the excess glaze is caught in the interior shape, which I then spend a few moments swirling around to create a thick layer of glaze on the inside. and then the exact same process is repeated for the second one. Steel and bronze, almost ready to be fired. First though, each bowl needs to be tidied up, the tongue marks rubbed over and the feet sponged clean of any droplets of glaze that have settled on the wax. It's a slow, repetitive process, but it really does make all the difference, as the neater the layer of glaze looks at this point, the more even and flush it is all the way around, the better it should look once fired. Although with all the metal these contain, I really have no idea what's going to happen. For the gas reduction firing, I'm also going to be brushing some bat wash over these. This is essentially a watered down variant of my wadding recipe, and yes, it should provide one extra layer of protection, as once fired this stuff turns very flaky, and if any metal or glaze sticks against it, it should just lift away, taking the bat wash with it, which can then be easily ground off. But I'm also going to be using wadding too, which I carefully position around the foot in such a way that none of them make any contact with the glaze itself. The wadded bowls are then placed onto the bat wash trays and are carefully pushed down, so they sit nice and level, so they don't teeter from side to side. The metal infused bowls can then be taken over to the kiln and packed inside. This is my Rohde KG-340 gas kiln, which is fueled with mains gas, and it's that which allows me to fire in a reduction atmosphere, which is something my electric kiln cannot do. Being able to fire in a reduced atmosphere opens up another world of colour and texture, and in this instance that will change the copper and the iron drastically, as compared to if you were to fire the same materials in an electric kiln. So please do bear that in mind if you're doing experiments like this. The ways metal reacts in both atmospheres is very different, and what comes out of this gas reduction fired kiln will not be the same compared to if you fired the same metals in an oxidized atmosphere to the same temperature. The glaze firing begins at 7 o'clock in the morning and typically takes about 8 to 8.5 hours to complete. Every 30 minutes I log the time, hour, temperature, gas, air and the damper position, and then I place the temperature on the graph above, which helps me see if the temperature is rising up too quickly or too slowly, and it gives me a good curve to follow in subsequent firings. I take it slow initially, as if you very rapidly increase the temperature, the pots inside, in certain situations, can explode, bursting almost, scattering shards everywhere. Once the pyrometer reads 860 degrees, I initiate the reduction atmosphere by increasing the gas pressure, the air pressure, and by sliding the dampers to half cover the flues at the top. Simply put, this causes too much gas to accumulate inside with an insufficient amount of oxygen present for the fuel to burn efficiently. As a result, the burning gas seeks oxygen and finds it in the clay and glazes himself, stripping it away and creating colours that you can only quite achieve in a gas kiln. Once cone 10 is flat and the temperature reads roughly 1290 degrees Celsius, the kiln can be switched off. And from this point, the kiln takes about 2 days to cool down. The door is then cracked open, and finally I can look at those two tests. The firing was decent overall, but it was perhaps a little bit cold in a few spots on the bottom shelf, which results in a slightly matte surface on the glaze. Well, my theory was right, I think. There are definitely some red spots covering that bowl. This is the bronze, and the copper has done exactly what I thought it might. The tone of the colour looks just like a classic copper red. Unfortunately, I think in combination with this pale green glaze, the pot looks a bit disease-ridden, like chickenpox, or something even worse. The waddings can then be plucked off, leaving ghostly prints of where they once were. Next is the bowl mixed with hammer scale. And, surprisingly, despite not being able to see much of the metal when trimming these pots, there's now tons of it seeping out and scattered across the surface. This one I don't mind nearly so much. It's quite similar to the additions of iron I've added previously, but it's covered the pot in a really arbitrary way, with molten blots of iron appearing in all shapes and sizes, which I really love. This, for me, works, although I think it could be scaled back, as I think there are just too many dots here for my liking, and it could afford to be a bit quieter and a bit more subtle. So, this combination for me doesn't work. But if a pot only had a scattering of blemishes, a few dots of red or one very large molten blot, like you can see here, then I don't think I'd mind it, as they're almost like beauty spots. I think the real problem is the contrast between the red and the green. But I have some crimson clay and a crimson glaze, and I think those, in combination with these flecks of bronze, could create some really beautiful objects, as the blossoms of red won't stand out nearly so much against the red glaze. But that's a test for the future. As for the steel hammer scale, I really quite like this. The contrast works, and I'd quite like to make some black and white pieces like this. Although next time I'll use less metal. There's a lot going on in these black specks close up, and they feel just a little bit rough in contrast with the smooth glaze. But I'm not finished with these yet. I don't love them at the moment, so I'm going to fire each of them again, to hopefully push the metal just a bit further to see if they melt or move down the glaze. And as these two bowls underfired initially, the glaze that surrounds the metal doesn't look quite like it should on some parts of the pot. So let's see what happens with another round up to 1290 degrees. And despite them again being packed onto the lowest shelf, which does sometimes fire cooler, a second dose of heat, even if it is a bit less, will correct any section that has underfired. And with this second firing complete, I now need to wait 48 hours to unpack the kiln for a second time. When I was firing this kiln load, I heard some pings and cracks at about 450 degrees, which is unusual for my firings. So when opening this kiln, I was really hoping that it wouldn't be the two metal bowls. With all the metal mixed into them, I was sure something might have gone wrong. But there's only one way to find out. And well, it is different. The glaze is now fired to the correct temperature. It's more glossy, and more of the bronze is broken through the glaze to form these metal spots, which does make it look a tiny bit like it's been riddled with bullets. Yet I do still, surprisingly, really like it, meaning the second firing really did make all the difference, which is infuriating in a way, as I can't make pots that all require being fired twice. But maybe all they need is firing to the correct temperature and for the bits of bronze to be closer to the surface. As for the steel hammer scale bowl, it too has changed a lot. There are now much larger blots of iron that have really flowed down the surface. I love when you can see cavities where the metal has flowed out. I think there's still too many inclusions in both of these, but as a one-off pair and experiment, it all went unusually well. Here are the rest of the pots from this kiln load, but those two bowls aren't quite finished yet. When placing the new waddings on these, I accidentally pushed them too far over the foot so they came into contact with the glassy surface inside the foot, resulting in specks of white being trapped in the green glaze. And while I can grind away much of it with these diamond pads, the worst of it will need grinding away with a Dremel. They only really need a touch, just a very light skim on the surface, and I really try not to overdo it, as it's very easy to accidentally scratch glaze that's unaffected and you can almost make it worse. I then lightly sanded the ground portion with some 600 grit wet and dry sandpaper, and that's the two pieces finished. At the end of the day, these are test pots, so I'm not entirely sure what I'll do with them yet, but with them being successful, I will make some pots for Alex, as thanks for sending me the metals. I'd also love to hear what you think about these two new additions. They won't be something I use a lot in my work. Rather, making the odd piece that is speckled and a bit more dramatic goes a long way in helping all the other pots stand out. I just have to figure out how to fire it more consistently, and I can't wait to make the crimson pots I spoke about earlier in this video. So if that is something you'd like to watch, make sure you subscribe. I hope you've enjoyed this journey and experimentation, and here's a quick before and after of the bowls after the first firing and how they appeared after the second reduction firing. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch. Do let me know if you made it to the end, and as always, I'll see you next time.